All started with the finding of a body. One gardener working on a remote estate had observed an odd disturbance in the ground behind an old shed. He had been working the ground for a new vegetable patch for weeks, but something about that specific area made the ground too soft, too flexible, even without recent rain. His spine tingling with cold, he resolved to call the cops. Arriving police examined the scene using forensic taphonomy, meticulously removing layer after layer of dirt until they discovered the decomposing body of an elderly man buried in the shallow grave. Dental records soon revealed the man's identity. Ivo, a 78-year-old patriarch of a once powerful family. Until lately, a man no one seemed to miss. Friends, sorry to interrupt, but please help me reach 2,000 subscribers by the end of the summer. Let's keep going. Nearly 6 months ago, Ivo's grandson, Jerome, a mild-mannered accountant living on the same large estate with his wife, Alessa, reported him gone. This was an apparently quiet life, simple and far from the upheavals of big cities. But under the surface, something had always been fermenting. Investigating Ivo's death, the police first concentrated on the dynamics of the family. This was obviously not your typical case right away. Ivo had been murdered. Thus, someone had tried to cover the crime. He had not just died and been buried. Ivo had suffered blunt force trauma to the head, according to the forensic pathologist. Lack of struggle indicated he knew his assailant. Though it hadn't been sufficient to destroy the corpse, his body displayed odd signs of fire exposure. Whoever killed Ivo had tried to burn the proof but had stopped short. As though stopped, the scant destruction suggested a hurried, panic-driven cover-up. Initially cooperative, Jerome and his wife Alessa expressed shock and grief over Ivo's death. After the death of Jerome's parents, years ago, he said his grandfather was a stubborn but decent man who had taken charge of family affairs. Alessa, on the other hand, was subdued. She was courteous to the researchers, but her icy attitude was obvious. Deeper the detectives dug, they found the family was not the idyllic, content unit it seemed to be. Though on the surface perfect, Jerome's marriage to Alessa had flaws deeper than anyone could have dreamed. Renata, Alessa's mother, had visited the estate regularly until roughly a year ago. She had then suddenly stopped. Alessa said, when asked about it, that her mother had chosen to spend a protracted trip overseas and they had lost regular communication. The detectives became dubious, though, because of something about her tone. Drawing on social media analysis and public records searches, they followed their instincts and discovered Renata had been seen regularly in the surrounding area until just 6 months ago, about the time Ivo vanished. Her unexpected disappearance seemed strange, and the detectives came to believe that Renata's relationship with the family contained a vital clue for cracking Ivo's murder. The revelation came when Karima, an elderly family estate employee, stepped forward. Years ago she retired, but she kept in touch with some of the present employees. Karima said she knew of a troubling rumor going around among the house staff. She said that Ivo had been having almost 10-year affair with Alessa's mother, Renata. Though Ivo was much older and Renata had been married to Alessa's father at the time, nobody had ever ventured to talk about it honestly. Renata had even received a set of costly presents from Ivo, all of which she had kept hidden from her husband. The affair was the absent piece of the jigsaw. Renata, it appeared, had confided in her daughter Alessa one evening, following an argument with Ivo. She told Alessa everything, how Ivo had pursued her, how she had given in to his advances, and how it had all fallen apart when her husband, Alessa's father, learned. Renata had tried to call off the affair, but Ivo had refused to let her go and would often threaten to reveal everything. Horrified and furious at her mother's betrayal, Alessa started to see Ivo not only as the grandfather of her husband, but also as a man who had wrecked her family. The sinister scheme Alessa's mind started to develop, a scheme for retribution that would destroy both families in the most brutal of ways, was something none could have predicted. Police discovered from witness interviews that Renata had paid one last visit to the estate, this time to confront Ivo. Renata was gone by the end of the evening, and Ivo had also disappeared the following morning. It was the night of a family gathering. Assuming he had left for one of his regular trips, none had questioned his absence. Renata, though, had never come back. The police started to suspect Alessa had not only known about her mother's affair, but also chosen to handle justice personally. The most startling discovery, though, was still to come. The researchers were going to find out what had actually happened that fatal night, and why Alessa had been left with only kill Ivo as option. All eyes turned to Alessa, the quiet wife, with a terrible secret, as the inquiry untangled. Alessa sat in the poorly lit living room, hands tightly around a long-gone cold cup of tea. Once a place of solace, the estate's walls seemed to be closing in on her and weighing her actions down. Alessa knew they would be back even though the researchers had left for the day. They were approaching her, nearer the truth. Renata arrived to visit late at night, her face pulled with anxiety and fear. Alessa had never seen her mother in that state before. Renata had always been a vivid woman, full of life and energy. But that evening, she looked broken, tormented by something she couldn't shake. Renata finally admitted everything: the affair with Ivo, the years of dishonesty, and the way it had split her marriage, when Alessa pressed. In that instant, Alessa's universe broke. The man she had come to know as her husband's loving grandfather was nothing more than a predator, a man who had controlled her mother and threatened the peace of her family. Her white-hot wrath, which blinded her to reason, was unlike anything she had ever felt before. Alessa stewed in her rage for weeks, trying to make sense of the treachery. But the more she considered it, the more she understood there was only one way to mend what had been damaged: to permanently remove Ivo from their lives. She had to guard her mother and make sure the truth never would be known. Alessa set her scheme into action on the evening of the family reunion. She had closely observed Ivo, noting his routines and flaws. At these gatherings, he frequently drank excessively. It was not unusual for him to wander off into the garden later, in search of privacy. Alessa knew she had a chance. She slipped a sedative into Ivo's drink as the evening wore on, something strong enough to confuse him, but not totally knock him out. Her heart thumping in her chest, she watched him get more and more wobbly patiently. Alessa trailed him out into the garden, a heavy metal statue from the study gripped in her hand, when he at last excused himself from the group. With his breath labored and his motions slow, Ivo had stumbled into the remote section behind the shed. Alessa walked gently over the soft grass, her feet quiet. He turned to face her, and his eyes showed recognition, then uncertainty, as he saw the monument in her hands. "Alessa, what are you?" He never brought his sentence to completion. Alessa lowered the monument on Ivo's head, using all the power she could generate. The quiet night echoed the sound of metal meeting bone, a sickening thud that seemed to pulse across the whole estate. Ivo gasped for breath, while crumpled to the ground, and blood pooled around him. Alessa wasn't done, though. She could not risk him surviving, or risk him sharing what had happened to anyone. She hit him repeatedly, her fury driving every blow until Ivo lay still, his body twisted and broken. She briefly stood there, staring at what she had done. Gone was the guy who had wrecked her family and caused so much suffering. But Alessa felt a cold emptiness pass over her, rather than relief. Panic seized as her reality of what she had done started to sink. She had to hide the dead. Alessa worked fast, excavating a shallow grave in the soft ground as Ivo's dead form dragged to the shed. She had thought of burning the body to eliminate the proof, but she buried him out of fear of being discovered. She doused the body in gasoline, briefly lit it to hide the injuries, but the flames flickered out before they could cause any real damage. Alessa's hands shook as she laid dirt over the tomb. She understood this was only a band-aid fix. She had to be ready whether someone found the body sooner or later. She pretended to be the worried wife and granddaughter-in-law the next morning, acting as though Ivo hadn't returned should be cause concern. Jerome had been working non-stop and had not noticed Ivo's absence right away. By the time he did, Alessa had already created a narrative about Ivo leaving for an unplanned trip. She maintained the charade for months, even as the guilt ate at her gut. But Alessa knew her time was running short. Now the cops were closing in. Smart enough, the researchers had already found Renata's affair. It wouldn't be long before they put the rest of the jigsaw together. Alessa considered whether there had ever been another path as she sat in the peace of the estate. Could she have challenged Ivo and insisted he leave them alone? Could she have trusted Jerome to handle things and confided in him? Though it was too late for regrets, the questions tormented her. She had decided. Now she would have to live with the results, or die trying to flee them. Alessa was unaware, meanwhile, that the detectives were already one step ahead. They had found someone she had never thought about, someone who had seen her that evening, a witness who had remained silent until recently. There was nothing she could do to stop the truth from slamming down around her. As Alessa sat at the defense table, her hands neatly folded in her lap, eyes forward, the courtroom buzzed with suspense. Her attorney had counseled her to keep her cool, but her heart hammered in her chest. The weight of public eyes on her, the ideal wife, the bereaved granddaughter-in-law now accused of a horrible crime, was palpable. From all around the town, the trial had drawn interest. The scandal of Ivo's murder, mixed with shocking disclosures of adultery and family treachery. The prosecution moved quickly to outline the series of events leading to Ivo's fatal night. They created a clear picture. Alessa, an enraged woman driven by the news of her mother's affair with her husband's grandfather. Ivo had been the man who seduced Renata, her mother, breaking apart Alessa's already delicate family. Renata had been the disloyal wife. The story combined elements of passion and retribution, so making it all too simple for the jury to picture Alessa as a cold-blooded killer. But it was not only the affair that sharply suggested Alessa's guilt. The prosecution disclosed their main witness, Tilda, an old friend of the family who had been visiting that evening. Alessa was walking toward the shed carrying the metal statue, something Tilda was not supposed to see. Tilda's account positioned Alessa at the scene just moments before Ivo was killed, even though she had not seen the act itself. Fear had kept her silent, but the guilt of knowing what she had seen had tormented her until she could no more stand it. Tilda's voice quitched when she stood up. She spoke of the late hours of the meeting and Alessa's deliberate movement across the estate, her eyes coldly determined. The courtroom gasped collectively when Tilda said she had heard the faint sounds of something striking, hard against flesh, but had persuaded herself it must have been an accident, a fall, or maybe something unrelated. She now understood that the lethal blows ending Ivo's life had been responsible. Alessa's attorney put out great effort to discredit Tilda's story. Could she have actually seen what she claimed? That evening, Tilda had been drinking. It had been dark, but damage was done. Tilda's testimony, along with the forensic data, created an impossible-to-refute picture. The soft ground behind the shed had been disturbed exactly where Ivo had been buried, and the forensic examination of the metal monument revealed traces of his blood. The defense tried to distribute the guilt, implying Renata had been more involved directly in the crime. Renata, after all, was the one having an affair. Wasn't it more likely that a confrontation between the two couples, spiraling out of control, caused Ivo's death? But Renata's absence, her unexplained disappearance following that evening, worked against Alessa. Where was Renata now if she killed Ivo? As it happened, nobody had heard from Renata since that evening. Her last known place was the estate, but she had disappeared completely. Renata's disappearance became evidently as important as Ivo's murder as the trial dragged on. The prosecution claimed that Alessa had not only killed Ivo, but also disposed of her mother, so committing far more terrible crimes. Though the implication alone was sufficient to turn public opinion against her, there was no evidence to back up this assertion. Then, the disclosures regarding Alessa's own marriage to Jerome emerged. Originally helpful, Jerome had become more withdrawn as the inquiry went on, trying to reconcile the charges against his loving wife with the picture of her. With an eye toward the jury, the defense summoned him to the stand, hoping his testimony would humanize Alessa. Alessa was a good wife, Jerome had said, his voice soft and breaking under strain. But I had no idea how profoundly everything had troubled her. She never mentioned her mother's affair. Not to me, not to anybody. She held all of it inside, and it simply broke her. Using Jerome's words, the prosecution painted Alessa as emotionally unstable, a woman whose bottled-up anger had at last burst in violence. Jerome loved his wife clearly, but his testimony did more to harm than to benefit her. Presenting the findings of a biochemical marker analysis on the ground close to Ivo's grave, the prosecution delivered their last blow. Alessa had indeed tried to burn Ivo's body before burying him, quickly hiding her tracks. The chemicals found matched those often found in accelerants. Built brick by brick, it was a painstaking case where it appeared the result was certain by the time the closing arguments were delivered. Using Alessa's state of mind at the murder, her attorney argued for forgiveness. The prosecution responded with a harsh reality, though, which premeditated. Alessa had acted deliberately, coldly striking Ivo, then methodically hiding her crime. The jury's decision, guilty of first-degree murder, rang across the courtroom like the last strike of a hammer. The judge sentenced without any doubt. Alessa would spend her entire life in jail, without the chance of parole. Alessa gazed ahead, expressionless, as the gavel came down, sealing her fate. Avenging the man who had wrecked her mother's life, she had accomplished what she had set out to do, but she had destroyed her own in doing this. Though the trial was finished, the fallout was only starting. Though the courtroom had emptied and the trial had concluded, the ripples of the case persisted far and wide. For the general people, it was a scandalous ending. A rich woman driven to kill by a web of lies, treachery, and passion. Alessa's face was splashed across front pages in the newspapers, which examined her life in ways nobody could have predicted. She was a cold-blooded killer, notorious for the graphic murder of her husband's grandfather. She was no more the quiet wife of a respected accountant. Benevolent headlines notwithstanding, the actual narrative was far more convoluted. The trial revealed even more secrets, secrets Alessa had taken great care to hide, but could no longer keep under cover. Disturbed by the result of the trial, Jerome withdrew into himself. The estate where so much had happened, the house he and Alessa had lived in, became a mausoleum of memory. Neither could he reconcile the woman he had loved with the killer she had grown to be, nor could he get rid of the picture of his wife on trial for murder. Particularly after the trial exposed just how much Jerome had missed and how blind he had been to the storm building in his own house. His guilt tormented him. Although he had always known his family was broken, he had never considered such catastrophe as the outcome. More than that, the disclosure of his grandfather's affair with Renata destroyed the picture of the strong moral family he had believed in, not least of all shocking him to the core. Raised after the death of his parents, his grandfather had been a manipulator, a man who exploited the frailty of others, even his daughter-in-law. Jerome's faith in his family had collapsed to rubble. Still, one question remained unresolved. What had happened to Renata, even following the trial? Her disappearance had been looked at by the police, but no trace of her had turned up. She seemed to have turned into thin air. Naturally, there were rumors, whispers of Alessa killing her mother too, of Renata buried somewhere on the estate, exactly as she had done with Ivo. But no body, no crime scene, no proof could justify those assertions. Renata was simply gone, leaving behind a daughter to fall for a murder she had not been there to see. Haunted by the possibility that Alessa had killed his grandfather in cold blood, Jerome now considered another terrible truth. Had she killed her own mother too? No matter how much he wanted to ignore, it was a possibility. Still, deep down, something didn't fit. Jerome dug farther into the study as the months went by. He couldn't let it go, couldn't accept that the woman he had loved had acted so horribly without cause. Searching for some clue that would explain what had truly happened to Renata, he started reading over old letters, papers, and emails. Then he discovered it. An email buried far in Alessa's inbox, dated the day before Ivo's murder. That came from Renata. Though its contents chilled Jerome's spine, the message was vague. Renata had crafted in it, "I'm leaving. I can't stay here anymore. Ivo won't stop. He's threatening to ruin everything if I not continue seeing her. Alessa knows, and she's furious. She's talking about doing something drastic. I'm scared for her. For us. By the time you..." Over and over Jerome went over the email, his mind racing. Renata had left, afraid of what Alessa might do or of what Ivo had evolved into, not vanished without a trace. The email presented a different picture, one in which Renata was the victim rather than the affair starter. Driven by a need to protect her mother, Alessa had been pushed over the brink. Ivo had manipulated her. With the fresh evidence, Jerome called the police, but it had little effect on how the matter turned out. Alessa had already been found guilty. The email, while illuminating Renata's mental state, did not alter the fact that Alessa had cold-blooded killed Ivo. Renata, according to the authorities, had probably left the nation using whatever means available to escape the guilt and anxiety about her affair becoming public. For Jerome, however, the email was absolutely vital. It clarified Alessa's motivations for acting as she had and for her intense anger. His grandfather had been a predator, a man who destroyed families for his own gratification, not only a man having an affair. Alessa's actions could be understood even if they cannot be pardoned. Jerome couldn't get away from the impression, though, that Alessa was hiding, that there was more to the tale. Hoping for answers, he paid her a visit in prison, but Alessa said nothing. She did not deny the murder. Neither did she confess to knowing what had happened to her mother. She just fixed hollow eyes on Jerome, as though all the struggle had been exhausted from her. Jerome stopped looking for the truth eventually. After the estate was sold, the money went toward paying debt accumulated during the trial and covering attorney fees. Jerome left, seeking to begin a fresh life, far from the sight of a graveyard of secrets and falsehoods. Regarding Alessa, her once orderly and quiet life, now only a memory. She stayed in prison. She never told Renata what she had done or mentioned the evening she killed Ivo. Deeply buried in her, locked away with the other secrets she would take to her tomb, the truth of what had happened to her mother stayed hidden, though at great expense. Justice had ultimately been done. 2 families had been devastated, and everyone engaged had their life irrevocably changed. Alessa had sought retribution, but it had cost her freedom, her future, and the truth she could never totally flee. Thus, the last chapter of the narrative was written in silence, the truth about Renata's fate lost in the shadows and leaving just the wreckage of a broken family. Years went by, and the sad chapter in the life of a society that had progressed lost public memory of Alessa and Ivo. Jerome, though, was unable to quite flee its shadow. Eventually, trying to start over, he remarried. The past tormented him. Renata's disappearance left a mystery, like a ghost he couldn't drive out. Long after the dust had settled, one peaceful evening Jerome got an anonymous letter. Written in shaky handwriting, it comprised a few lines. "I ran because I had no choice. I'm alive, but I'll never return. I'm sorry for everything." She didn't kill me, Jerome knew. There was no name or indication of who had written it. Renata was alive, someplace far away, hiding from the life she had wrecked and the daughter who had paid the cost. For a long time, Jerome sat with the letter in his hands, fixated on the words and divided between relief and grief. Renata had fled, but at what expense? Alessa had been punished for a crime motivated by love and betrayal. Now, she would never know the whole truth. The letter provided only a reminder that, like Ivo, some facts would always remain buried under layers of soil and lies. It offered no closure. For Jerome, it amounted to the last reckoning, the last piece of a jigsaw he would never be able to completely fit. The narrative thus concluded in silence, rather than with answers.